The office was a place of high tension, deadlines, and expectations. It was a world where every action mattered, where precision and professionalism were paramount. Yet, within this structured environment, there was an undercurrent of something more personal, more human. For Clara, the office was her domain. She had worked hard to get where she was, constantly proving herself with her sharp intellect, impeccable work ethic, and unwavering dedication. But there was something else that kept her on edge: her boss, Matthew. Matthew was everything Clara was not. Confident, decisive, and charismatic. He commanded respect with a single glance, and it was nearly impossible not to be drawn to him. Clara had always admired him from afar. He was the kind of man who made others feel small, but in a way that pushed them to do better. The way he held himself, his composed demeanor, it was magnetic. There was a distance between them that Clara respected, and that was enough to keep things professional, or so she thought. At first, the interactions between them were simple and businesslike. He would drop by her desk occasionally to discuss a report, ask her opinion on a strategy, or simply give a task. Clara would nod, take notes, and proceed. It was all straightforward. But every now and then, when their eyes met across the office, there was a subtle shift in the air, a fleeting moment where the professional distance between them felt just a bit thinner. Clara dismissed it at first, convincing herself that it was just her imagination. But she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest every time their paths crossed. Clara's colleagues noticed her growing discomfort. There was an energy in the office that didn't escape anyone. She became more focused, more driven, but also more distant. Conversations with her were shorter, and the usual lightheartedness she once carried was slowly fading. Her mind was preoccupied, constantly calculating the next move, analyzing each exchange with Matthew. She wasn't blind to the way he looked at her, how his eyes lingered just a second too long during their meetings, how his tone softened when he spoke to her. He was always respectful, never crossing any obvious boundaries, yet there was something there, something that made Clara's heart race whenever she was near him. The office, with its clean lines and sterile ambience, felt like a prison at times, each hour dragging longer than the last. But the moments when Matthew would approach her, ask for her input on something, or simply check in on her work, were different. They felt almost personal. A casual touch on her arm when handing over a document, a lingering gaze as he passed by her desk. Clara told herself it was nothing, that he was simply being kind, nothing more. But deep down, she knew she was lying to herself. It was more than kindness. It was the way he made her feel seen in a room full of people who only cared about the bottom line. She knew the risks. She had heard the office gossip, seen the way some of her coworkers looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. She had been careful, always keeping her interactions with Matthew strictly professional, maintaining the boundaries of the office. But the pull was undeniable. Clara's world had always been about control over her work, her emotions, her reputation. She had never been one to let anything, or anyone, distract her from her goals. But Matthew was different. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't the type to chase after her or flirt openly, but he didn't need to. His power lay in the way he made her feel, in the way his attention made her believe, even for just a moment, that she was more than just another employee. And as much as she hated to admit it, she began to crave it. Every time he walked into the room, her heart skipped a beat. It was maddening and exhilarating at the same time. Clara had worked so hard to earn her place here, and yet she found herself wondering if she was willing to risk it all for a fleeting moment of attention from a man who seemed to hold all the cards. What was it about him that made her question everything she believed in? Every rational thought she tried to cling to seemed to unravel when she was near him. For now, Clara kept her distance. She focused on her work, buried herself in tasks, trying to avoid the growing tension that lingered in the air between her and Matthew. But she couldn't help it. She was drawn to him, just as he seemed to be drawn to her. She knew this wasn't supposed to happen. Relationships like this never did. Yet, as days passed, she couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze, the subtle shifts in his body language when he spoke to her. It was as if he was waiting for something, and so was she. Clara had always been able to compartmentalize her emotions, to keep them in check, but in the presence of Matthew, she found it harder and harder to maintain that control. And deep down, she knew that something was bound to change soon. Something that would break the careful balance she had worked so hard to maintain. She just didn't know yet whether it would be a step forward or the beginning of something much more dangerous. It happened on a late afternoon, the office buzzing with the usual quiet hum of productivity. Clara was sitting at her desk, reviewing some reports, when the sound of footsteps drew her attention. It was Matthew. He approached her with a stack of documents, his usual professional demeanor in place, but there was something different this time. His presence felt heavier, more deliberate. He asked if she had a moment to discuss a project, his voice calm but with a hint of something else, an undertone that Clara couldn't quite place. She nodded, trying to keep her composure. She wasn't sure why, but her heart began to race. She told herself it was just another meeting, just another task. But as they walked toward the conference room, the air between them thickened. There was an unspoken understanding, a tension that had been building for weeks, and now it was undeniable. Inside the conference room, Matthew closed the door behind them. Clara sat at the table, trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism, but she could feel his eyes on her, studying her in a way that made her skin prickle. He sat across from her, placing the documents down. His gaze didn't leave hers. It was subtle at first, the way he lingered just a little too long. But it was enough to make Clara feel exposed. She shifted in her seat, her palms suddenly clammy. They discussed the project, just business at first. But soon, the conversation shifted. It was no longer about numbers or strategy, it was about personal things that didn't belong in a corporate setting. He asked her how she was feeling, how her work was going, how she was handling the pressure. Clara felt herself opening up, responding more honestly than she intended. She mentioned the stress of the workload, the late nights, the feeling of being overwhelmed. Matthew, as always, listened intently, his attention unwavering. But this time, there was something more in his eyes. A softness. A concern. It was the kind of attention that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Before she could stop herself, Clara found herself, especially not him. The next week, the tension between Clara and Matthew was palpable. She couldn't escape the memories of their last meeting, the way his touch had sent a shiver down her spine, the way his eyes had lingered on her as if he were waiting for something. The office, once a place of routine and focus, had become a maze of unspoken words and stolen glances. Clara found herself obsessing over every interaction with him, each one heavier than the last. It started innocently enough. Matthew had called her into his office to go over some figures for a project. Clara arrived on time, her heart already pounding in her chest. She tried to keep things professional, but there was an underlying current that neither of them could ignore. The conversation began just like any other, business, numbers, deadlines, but the longer they spoke, the closer the air seemed to get. She noticed the way he was looking at her again, his gaze holding something deeper than just a colleague's interest. His voice had a certain edge to it, smoother, more intimate. Without warning, Matthew stood up from his desk, his hand resting on the back of her chair. "You look tired," he said, his voice low, as if he were confiding something private. Clara couldn't think straight. She could feel the heat from his body so close to hers, and for the first time, she noticed how his presence seemed to consume the space. "I know the pressure's been high," he continued, "but you're doing well. You don't have to do it all alone." Clara swallowed, unsure how to respond. His words were meant to comfort, but there was something else in the way he spoke them, something that made her feel seen, maybe too much so. Her breath hitched, and she quickly turned her focus back to the papers in front of her, trying to avoid the growing attraction that was undeniable now. Matthew's hand, which had been resting on her chair, slowly moved to her shoulder. It was just a touch, but it felt like an anchor, pulling her closer to a reality she wasn't sure she was ready for. Clara stiffened, every part of her telling her to push him away, to remind herself of the lines they couldn't cross. But in that moment she didn't. She let herself stay in the moment, in the heat of his proximity. The weight of his hand on her shoulder made her body respond in ways she hadn't expected, and it left her questioning everything. His thumb brushed gently against her skin, the contact sending a jolt of electricity through her. The room felt smaller, the space between them narrowing. Clara could feel her pulse quicken, a sense of desire mixing with her guilt. She wanted to pull back, to leave, to restore the boundaries they once had. But she didn't. She was rooted to the spot, her heart racing, her mind a whirl of conflicting thoughts. Matthew's voice broke the silence. "Clara," he said softly, almost a whisper, as if testing the waters. "You're too hard on yourself. We're in this together. You don't have to face everything alone." The words seemed innocent, but Clara could feel the weight of them, the unspoken meaning that hovered between them. He wasn't just offering comfort. There was something else, an invitation to move closer, to break that invisible line they had once respected. Clara felt the walls she had carefully built begin to crumble. She knew she should pull away, but her body betrayed her, leaning ever so slightly into his touch. Without thinking, she turned her head toward him, meeting his gaze. For a moment, time seemed to stop. It was like they were both holding their breath, waiting for the next move, for someone to make a decision. Matthew didn't look away. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with an emotion Clara couldn't quite name. He took another step closer, his lips barely an inch from her ear. "I've been thinking about you," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a question. It was a statement, and it hung in the air between them like a secret they both understood. Clara's mind raced. This was the moment, the one she had been dreading and anticipating all at once. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the undeniable pull of desire that was becoming harder to ignore. But just as quickly, the weight of reality crashed over her. This wasn't just a moment of passion, it was a decision. The decision to cross a line they could never uncross. Her body tensed, her breath shallow. She wanted to say something, to stop him, to stop herself. But her voice failed her. Instead, she found herself leaning in closer, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was tentative at first, a soft exploration that deepened with each passing second. It was as if they had both been waiting for this moment, for the walls to come down. His hand moved from her shoulder to the back of her neck, pulling her closer as the kiss intensified. Clara's mind screamed at her to pull away, to resist, but the pull between them was too strong, too consuming. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the connection, the promise of something more. She could feel it in every touch, every breath. The lines between them, once so clear, had been completely blurred. In that moment, Clara was no longer just an employee. She was something else entirely, something she didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The kiss ended, but the silence that followed was deafening. Neither of them spoke for a moment, both unsure of what to do next. Clara stood there, her mind spinning, her heart still racing. She had just taken the first step into a world she couldn't return from. And though part of her screamed in protest, another part, the part that had been hiding for so long, was ready to see where this path would lead. The days that followed felt like a blur, a chaotic mix of adrenaline, guilt, and anticipation. Clara couldn't focus on her work anymore. Every time she sat down to read through reports or plan strategy, her mind would wander back to that moment in Matthew's office. The kiss, the way he had touched her, the intensity of everything that had passed between them, it consumed her thoughts. She tried to dismiss it, to tell herself it was a mistake, but every glance she shared with him afterward only reinforced what had begun. At first, there was an unspoken understanding. They didn't mention what had happened, but neither of them could ignore it. The atmosphere between them was thick with tension. Clara could feel his eyes on her more often, his presence closer than ever. It was as if he was constantly around, always just a few feet away, like a magnet pulling her in. And despite herself, she found it hard to pull away. The weight of their secret hung in the air between them, making everything feel more urgent, more intense. But as the days wore on, the pressure of keeping everything hidden became unbearable. Clara couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread that came with knowing what they had done. She had crossed a line that, in any other context, would have been impossible to uncross. She had broken the rules of professional conduct, and she knew the consequences could be catastrophic. It wasn't just her career at stake now. It was everything: her reputation, her integrity, her sense of self. Matthew, however, seemed unaffected by the weight of it all. He remained calm, composed, as if nothing had changed. But Clara noticed the subtle shifts in his behavior: the way he would pull her into his office for private meetings, the way he would find excuses to spend time alone with her. Each time, the tension built, and each time,